This one I wrote this one, and I said, God, Tom could have written this poem. Maybe he did. It's called Wolf Soup. It's, when I have a son, he's 11 now, but when he was young, I was given these fairy tales to read to him. And they were the traditional fairy tales, but they were strangely altered. I don't know if you know what's happened to the fairy tales that at least my generation grew up with. They've been sanitized. They've been made safe for young children to consume. And this is about one of those tales. It's called Wolf Soup. It's about the three little pigs. In the version of the three little pigs that I've been given to read my child, the first two pigs, after the wolf has blown their houses down, little piggy, let me come in, find refuge with their perspicacious brother. The wolf, for his part, displays no motivation, only an impulse arrested from his body's churning electrolytes to demolish architectural follies. He doesn't chase and corner the pigs. He doesn't have a grudge against the race of pigs, nor is he in the mood for pig's knuckles or a nice pig's ear taco or even a simple ham sandwich. And when he comes down the chimney of the third pig's house, the one he can't blow down, the one made of brick, with its dormer windows tricked out in blue, their trim decorated with orange daisies, he suffers for his motiveless malignancy in the soup pot waiting for him, the lid of which has been removed with a timely flourish, nothing worse than a scalding, and runs back to his lair somewhere over the hill. Everyone has survived their lessons. Everyone, as in the last judgment of the Zoroastrians, is saved, even the wolf, today exterminated across much of the world, and almost so in the 48 contiguous states. The real story, which is locked in my desk while I write this encryption, goes, as you all remember, differently. In it, the wolf eats the first two pigs, but the third pig, the smart pig, the shrewd little pig, eats him in a soup flavored with the turnips gathered in a memorable prior episode. Long did that pig rest a pensive trotter on the windowsill as he looked down the dusty road traveled by the wolf. His brothers were dead, his mother unapproachable in her grief, and for weeks the taste of wolf, at once unguent, farinaceous, brittle and serene, touched his mind with a golden fire. In a pig's eye, he thought, as his molecules began to recombine. My son might be ready for this version of the story. Like most 4-year-olds, he's precocious and realistic and bloody-minded. He already knows, for example, that Jack was nothing better than a common thief, and has at some point observed that giants let their fingernails grow, sometimes to hideous lengths. The next poem is called North of Manhattan, and it is written about the area where Tom lived for a long, long time and was a leading light of the Sarah Lawrence faculty. And I worked there. I thought it was written in my contract that I had to say these things. Yeah. In fact, the very wording, And I said, if you want the check, you got to say this. Anyway, the interesting thing about this poem is that, I was, when you go to Sarah Lawrence from New York, you take the Major Deegan and you get off at this exit, Cross County, Kimball Avenue. And you make a left turn, and it's about, 500 yards to my office. And as I was making that left turn, I saw a bus that said Dyer Avenue bus to the subway. And it was one of the most miraculous things. It only happens a few times in your life as a poet that a poem just comes tumbling out, you know. And I had the first 30 lines of this poem in the 500 yards it took me to get from, you know, that light to the office. You know, it was just, you know. And I knew it was never again. It was like, you know. Fernando Pessoa, the great Portuguese poet, has this, he describes this day where he wrote 40 poems. You know, it's like, wow. It was like that, you know. Okay, it's called North of Manhattan. You can take the Dyer Avenue bus to where the subway terminates, just inside the Bronx, and be downtown before you realize how quickly your body has escaped your mind, stretching down the tracks on a beam until the band snaps and the body slips free and is gone, out the crashing doors, through the stiles, and up the long chutes, to burn both ways at once down the avenues, ecstatic in its finitude, with all the other bodies, the bundles of molecules fusing and dispersing on the sidewalks. 10 to the 100th power, bundles of molecules are looking at paintings. Bundles of molecules are eating corn muffins, crab cakes, shad roe, spring lamb, rice pudding. Bundles of molecules are talking to each other, sotto voce or in a commanding voice. I agree with you 100%, dog. I looked for you today, but you'd already gone. I've left the amended, restated sublease agreement on your desk. I'm going home now, and you think about what you did. The ear grows accustomed to wider and wider intervals. The eye senses shapes in the periphery toward which it dares not turn to look. One bundle is selling another a playback machine, a 6 square-inch wax paper reticule of powdered white rhinoceros horn, an off-season discounted ticket to Machu Picchu, a gas-powered generator for when the lights go out, a dime bag of Mexican brown. It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sunlight is stealing inch by inch down the newly repointed red brick wall. She comes into the kitchen wrapped in the quilt and watches as he fries eggs. After what just happened, you want to eat? She says in disgust. Will she or will she not, back in the bedroom, lift the gun from the holster and put it in her purse? The mind, meanwhile, is still somewhere around Tremont Avenue, panting down the tracks, straining from the past to the vanishing present. It will never catch up and touch the moment. It will always be in this tunnel of its forever, where aquamarine-crusted bulbs feed on a darkness that looks all around without seeing, and fungus, ear-like, starved for light, sprouts from walls where drops of rusted water condense and drip. Don't say I didn't warn you about this. Don't say my concern for your welfare never extended to my sharing the terrible and addictive secrets that only death can undo. Because I'm telling you now that you can also take the same bus north, crossing over against the traffic spilling out of the mall and waiting 20 minutes in the kiosk with the Drambuie ad. There, isn't that better? More passengers are getting off than on. The girl with the skates going home from practice will soon get off, as will the old woman whose license to drive has been taken from her. They will enter houses with little gazebos tucked in their gardens, and then, for just a while, the mind will disembark from the body, relaxed on its contoured plastic seat, and go out to make fresh tracks in the snow, and stand and breathe under the imaginary trees, the horsehair pine, the ambergris tree, the tree that the bulbul loves, the nebula tree. My new book, which is going to be published in May, was conceived as a book with sort of long, loose, prose-like poems like that one, and a chunk of prose, also actual prose, a piece of memoir writing, and a bunch of very small, sharp, geometric lyrics. And I imagine the whole books, I had this nice image of the book as this sort of sea of prose in which chunks of lyric matter were bobbing along. It's kind of, and I'm going to read a couple of those lyrics, or a few of them. This one is called Survivor. We hold it against you that you survived. People better than you are dead, but you still punch the clock. Your body is wizened but has not bled its substance out on the killing floor, or flatlined in intensive care, or vanished after school, or stepped off the ledge in despair. Of all those you started with, only you are still around. Only you have not been listed with the defeated and the drowned. So how could you ever win our respect? You who had the sense to duck, you with your strength almost intact, and all your good luck. Another one, somewhat in that vein, aphasia, which is a medical condition whereby you lose control of language. Often happens after a stroke. Aphasia. His signs flick off. His names of birds and his beautiful words, eleemosynary, fur, cinerarium, reckless, skip like pearls from a snapped necklace, scattering over linoleum. His thinking won't venture out of his mouth. His grammar heads south. Pathetic his subjunctives, just as pathetic his mangling the emphatic enclitic he once was the master of. Still, all in all, he has his inner weather of pure meaning. Though the wind is keening through his Alps, and his clouds hang low, and the forecast is rain mixed with snow, heavy at times. This one's called Anima. Do you guys know what the anima is? It's, the myth is originally found in Plato's Symposium, and it was made much of by Carl Gustav Jung, the 20th century psychoanalyst. And the idea is that our souls are cut in half, and we spend all our lives wandering around looking for the other half, which is, if you're a man, an anima, and if you're a woman, you're animus. And so that's the idea behind this poem. Anima. Not Garbo, for instance, or my wife, but white, though flecks and patches of melanin coruscate the olive acres rising between her breasts and her thighs, and African ovals frame her eyes. 28 and chemically complex, she studies all night for her GED. At dawn, she goes out to do what her doctor tells her to do. Dig in her garden where she grows, the rose they call the cabbage rose, and the huge iris they call the fleur-de-lis. But every so often her mind goes slack and desperate. Spectral and pale, she walks her hills in a long black veil, mourning me, her quizzical, her other, her bitter, prodigal, absconded half. Where, just where am I, that I can never come back? I wrote that poem and I showed it to my wife. And she said, very sternly, "Now you have to write me a poem, Vijay." And that's this one. It's called Thelma, which is not her name. Her name is Thelma. We have a small place on an ugly street, though we keep it spick and span. I take the garbage out, but you, Thelma, you the man, brilliant as the velvet eye setting off a peacock's feather, rayed as the sun is rayed through storming, broken weather and gilt-edged clouds. And me? I strip to my birthday suit and scream out the window at the Yemeni kids, who scream back, "Sharmut," rolling by on their rollerblades. You and me, Thelma, in the little squirt, with me on the stoop, in my cap turned backward and my undershirt. I'm going to read two more poems that are sort of related to each other. And the last poem in my second book, which is called The Long Meadow, and the last poem in my first book. I'll read The Long Meadow first. The Long Meadow. This, by the way, is very loosely based on an incident in the Mahabharata, which is a Sanskrit epic 9 times the volume of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. You know, there are people in India who have claimed to have memorized the whole thing, but no one would stick around to find out. Right. The Long Meadow. Near the end of one of the old poems, the Sun of Righteousness, the source of virtue and civility, on whose back the kingdom is carried, as on the back of the tortoise the earth is carried, passes into the next world. The wood is dark, the wood is dark, and on the other side of the wood the sea is shallow, warm, endless. In and around it there is no threat of life. So little is the atmosphere charged with possibility that he might as well be wading through a flooded basement. He wades for what seems like forever, and never stops to rest in the shade of the metal rain trees, springing out of the water at fixed intervals. Time, though endless, is also short, so he wades on until he walks out of the sea and into the mountains, where he burns on the windward slopes and freezes in the valleys. After unendurable struggles, he finally arrives at the celestial realm. The god waits there for him. The god invites him to enter. But looking through the glowing portal, he sees on that happy plain not those he thinks wait eagerly for him, his beloved, his brothers, his companions in war and exile, all long since dead and gone, but, sitting pretty and enjoying the gorgeous sunset, his cousin and bitter enemy, the cause of that war, that exile, whose arrogance and vicious indolence plunged the world into grief. The god informs him that yes, those he loved have been carried down the river of fire. Their thirst for justice offended the cosmic powers, who were jealous of justice. In their place in the celestial realm, called Alaukika in the ancient texts, the breaker of faith is now glorified. He at least acted in keeping with his nature. Who has not felt a little of the despair the Son of Righteousness now feels, staring wildly around him? The god watches, not without compassion and a certain wonder. This is the final illusion, the one to which all the others lead. He has to pierce through it himself, without divine assistance. He will take a long time about it, with only his dog to keep him company. The mongrel dog, celebrated down the millennia, who has waited with him, shivered and burned with him and never abandoned him to his loneliness. That dog bears a slight resemblance to my dog, a skinny, restless, needy, overprotective mutt who was rescued from a crack house by Suzanne. On weekends, and when I can shake free during the week, I take her to the Long Meadow in Prospect Park, where dogs are allowed off the leash in the early morning. She's gray-muzzled and old now, but you can't tell that by the way she runs. And this is another poem about someone who gets lost in the woods. And it's called Lifeline. And it's a narrative, a little bit longer. Lifeline. As soon as he realized he was lost, that in kicking around his new job in his head, the new people he'd met, and how he could manage a week in Seaside, he'd stumbled past the muddy fork of road that slithered down in switchbacks to Highway 20, and now couldn't tell, through rain clouds coarse as pig iron and about as cold, which languished over each of the scarred mountain tops, where west was, or east, or north, or feel the sun's direction. He stopped, as he knew he should, and doubled back. An hour at the worst would bring him to the International, inert in a ditch with its radiator punctured, its axle broken, and blood from his temple on the steering wheel. He wished he'd never set eyes on that truck. Here he was, trudging like an idiot through a 1,000-square-mile dead spot of Douglas fir, soaked to the bone and hungry, with his head throbbing. He wasn't up to this, he said to himself, staring disconsolately outward to the numberless ridges and valleys, singed with the bitter green of the firs. But why hadn't he reached the truck yet? Or at least somewhere familiar, where he could get his bearings again? He didn't recognize the ridge he was on. He'd never seen this particular patch, glinting with wild crocus prongs, of clear-cut ground, torched and scarified. Should he keep going, or return again? There and then he made his third mistake. Hearing, or thinking he heard, deep in the valley below him plunged in mist, a chainsaw start and sputter, he made off down toward the sound. It would be a Jippo logger scrounging deadfall cedar for shake-bolt cords, or a civilian with a $20 permit to cut firewood for sale at a roadside stand. Either way, he could get directions and hitch home by dark. Hours later, night found him in a hollow, shouting until he was hoarse for someone, anyone. The weekend was almost here, and no one at work would miss him before Monday. He lived alone, idiot, he lived alone, and couldn't count on a single person to send out an alarm. Those first hours he spent shivering under a lip of rock, wide awake, startling at each furtive, night-hunting animal sound, each flap of the raptors in the branches overhead. On the second day, he lost his glasses. It happened like this. As he struggled over the cryptic terrain all morning, terrain that would seem, if looked at from high above, from a helicopter or a plane flying low enough to pierce the dense, lazy foliage of clouds, created, finessed, meticulously contrived to amaze, like a marvelous relief map of papier-mâché, revealing its artifice only in the improbable dramas of its contours, its extravagant, unlikely colors. He had what amounted to a real insight. All this was the brainchild of water, stretching back beyond the Pleistocene. How many millions of years? Imperial rain had traced without pity, over and over again, its counter-image on the newborn jagged mountains until the length of the coast had been disciplined to a system designed to irrigate and to nourish the soil. He decided he'd follow the water down. He'd use each widening tributary like the rung of a ladder to climb down from his awful predicament and soon work his way to the ocean, though, of course, long before that, he'd run across people. With this in mind, he came to a stream heavy and brown with the spring runoff, its embankment on his side steep to the point of perpendicularity, thick with brush, though on the other side a crown of ferns tumbled gently down to the next watershed. It seemed like a good idea to cross, and farther on he found a logged fir with a choker cable still attached. It must have snapped when they tried to yard the falled tree to the road high above, straddling the stream. A little more than halfway over, he slipped on the treacherous wood, and would have gone in but for the cable, which he lunged at just in time. That was his lifeline. Though flailing to save himself, he knocked the glasses from his head. Now they'd reach the sea long before him, if he ever would. He knelt down in the ferns, exhausted, by fits growing determined never to leave that spot. They'd find his bones 50 years from now, clothes and ID rotted away, a trillium poking through his rib cage, a cucumber vine trellised by the 7 sockets in his skull. The play of the thin, unending drizzle on the overlapping leaves he sank below, on the bark of the impassive trees looming around him, grew indistinguishable from the pulse turning loud in his head. The bruise on his forehead throbbed. There were rents and gashes everywhere down the length of his rain gear, which let the mist and the dampness in. Beyond a scant dozen inches, the world looked blurry, smeared bright, unattainable. Nothing in his life up until then, and if this had been pointed out to him, he would have acknowledged pride in it, suggested that anything resembling a speculative turn of mind cannibalized the adequate, rhythmic, progressive movements of his thoughts and feelings. But, still, as almost everyone does, he'd occasionally had inklings, stirrings, promptings, and strange intuitions about something just beyond the radius of his life. Not divine, necessarily, but what people meant when they referred to such things, which gave to the least of his actions its dream of complicity. Now he recognized, with a shock almost physical, that those inklings were just the returning, reanimated echo, on a different scale but similar to the echo we sometimes hear in our skulls, which leads us to the uncanny feeling that an experience we're having is one we've had before, at some other time. But does anything ever repeat itself? Of the vibrations his life made, bouncing off the things around him, sunk deep in their own being, and that life, his life, blossoming now in this daisy chain of accident and error, was nothing more or less than what there was. There was nothing hidden underneath this, but it was small, so small, as the life of his family was, his people, his species among the other species, firs, owls, plants whose names he didn't know, all of them minute, and the earth itself, its 4 billion plus years of life, just the faint phosphorescent track of a minute sea creature on an ocean for the annihilating dimensions of which words such as infinite and eternal were ridiculous in their inadequacy. He lay on his back inside the ferns and listened to the rain's clepsydral ticking. He tried to grasp, what was it? But it clattered away, that slight change in the pressure binding thing to thing, as when an upright sleeper shifts just a little, imparting to his dreams an entirely different train of meaning. Beyond those clouds the blue was there which shaded to blackness, and beyond that blackness the uncounted, terrifying celestial entities hung suspended only by the influence they had on one another. And all of this was just a seed inside a seed inside a seed. So that when, finally, late the next morning, he half crawled out of the woods and came in time to a wire fence in a clearing, less than 2 feet high and decorated with gleaming ceramic insulators, which indicated that a mild current, 5 volts at the most, ran through it to keep the foraging animals off the newly sown vegetable garden enclosed inside its perimeter, and saw beyond it the sprawl of the lawn, the 4x4 parked in the driveway, the stars and stripes on the flagpole, and the house, he stopped, paralyzed. The wind was blowing northwest. The clouds were breaking up under its steady persuasion. But, try as he did, he couldn't will himself to step lightly over that wire and cross the garden's sweet geometry and go up to the door and ask to be fed and made warm and taken home. By that small fence, he sat down and wept. Thank you.